Family annihilators are pretty unique because what would drive someone to end their life of their whole family? Most of the time, cases where someone does end the lives of their whole family comes on a special holiday, like Father's Day, Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, even Christmas. But what drives these people to do it? And it's a special breed of murderers to look into because the victims are people the closest to you, your own blood. But what if there was a case where an alleged family annihilator actually could have been involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? It sounds wild, but I'm so serious, it could be true. But how is that even possible? And how did people even come to that conclusion? Well, let's find out. Hey, I'm Serenity, and this is my channel, and welcome back to Holiday Hometown Horror Week, where I post one true crime video the gap between Christmas and New Year's Eve, so the 26th through the 30th, starting on Boxing Day, one true crime episode a day. Today, we're joined by Ginger and Pix and Nova. So, we're going to be discussing a family annihilator today who disappeared and many believe could have been responsible for a president's assassination. Before we begin, I just want to give trigger warnings for the following. Obviously, a family annihilator, President Kennedy's assassination, murder, dismemberment, and pretty gruesome details. So if you feel like those topics you'd be unable to handle, please stop watching, put yourself first, and I'll see you at a later date with a different video. If I get any information wrong, please kindly let me know down below. I try to get all the information as accurate as possible, but this is a cold case at least over 50 years old. But if one source says one thing and I can't confirm it using another source, I went with the most commonly reported detail. Sources will be linked down below as always for you to check out yourself. Lastly, this video is an informational research study that I'm sharing for academic entertainment reasons only. I mean absolutely no harm to anyone mentioned, especially the victim and the victim's family. So get comfy, grab a blanket, grab a snack, grab a drink. I have Pina Colada Celsius in here, and put on some cozy winter pajamas like me, and let's get into this. Over 60 years ago, a case in Houston, Texas would stun the whole city. On June 20th, 1965, a heinous discovery would be made in a local home, and it would remain a mystery to this day of who committed it. Two Houston police officers were called out on a welfare check on an elderly couple after the woman's nephew, Marvin, called the police stating that he hadn't heard from his aunt Edwina in about 4 days, and his calls kept being sent to voicemail, which is so unlike her. She would always pick up his calls. Police officers knocked on Marvin's aunt's door, Edwina Ivor, but they received no answer, and this is a welfare check, so they have to make sure to get in contact with the person. So officers forced their way into the home, and what they found was nothing out of the ordinary at first glance, except that there was old food on the dining room table and newspapers across the floor hiding something kind of in disarray. First officer that walked in was perplexed by the food just sitting on the dining room table that remains untouched. So he went into the kitchen to see what's going on. And in there he saw bloodied cabinets, and the fridge was covered in blood. Still pretty perplexed, he opened the refrigerator to see what happened. And he noticed that there was multiple cuts of washed, unwrapped meat neatly stacked on the fridge shelves. And that's not unusual because at first he thought that maybe this were just a fresh hog the homeowners bought and they butchered themselves. That's pretty normal in Texas. A lot of people have whole animals that maybe they raised themselves or they bought, and they have pieces of the whole animal in their fridge. But when he was closing the fridge door, that's when the officer noticed something was off. In the vegetable bin at the bottom of the fridge, there were 2 severed heads that were visible through the clear glass drawer. Now, those heads belonged to the homeowners of the house, and one of them belonged to the woman they were sent to do a wellness check visit on, Edwina Rogers, and her husband, Fred Christopher Rogers. And all that unwrapped, washed, prepped meat in the fridge that they thought belonged to a hog, that was actually the couple's dismembered body. All their limbs, including their heads and torsos, were in the fridge. The 2 police officers immediately called back up to the scene, and the rest of the couple's body parts would be located in other parts of the home. Their organs were in a nearby sewer, having been removed from their bodies and cut up into smaller pieces before being flushed down the toilet, and some remains to this day were never located. Those dismembered bodies would never be whole again. Now, the police would gather all the parts that they actually could locate within the home, and they had an autopsy performed on those parts. Fred's autopsy showed that he was bludgeoned to death, beaten by something, and it's believed that it was actually a claw hammer, the most common hammer most of us have in our houses. That's an ear toolbox. They believe that was the culprit. His eyes had been gouged out, and his genitalia were purposely removed before he was dismembered. Now, his wife's body, her autopsy had revealed that she had been beaten black and blue before being shot in the head execution style, right between her eyes. The autopsy was able to determine that Edwina and Fred Rogers had been murdered on June 20th, 1965, which is actually Father's Day. The medical examiner told the local paper, the Globe Times, and I quote, "Whoever did this apparently took their time and knew what they were doing. The dismembering was a fairly neat job." And upon further investigations, the police officers realized that the dismemberment had taken place upstairs in the bathroom based on blood patterns found there. And the person who had committed the crime probably had some verse of knowledge and understanding of anatomy based on the cuts. Besides the kitchen that had blood on the cabinets and the fridge, there was little blood around the house, and the house appeared to be cleaned up after, especially because the cuts seemed to be precise. What very little blood was actually located in Edwina and Fred's son's bedroom. Now, Charles Rogers, their son, his bedroom had a bloodied keyhole saw found in it, but Charles was nowhere to be located. Charles, the son, immediately became the #1 suspect in this case, and a warrant was issued for his location as a material witness to his parents' murder. However, when search parties began to look, they couldn't find anything. He would never be located again. So who was their 43-year-old son, Charles Frederick Rogers? Born December 30th, 1921, he enrolled at Texas A&M University in College Station in 1942, about 90 minutes and 95 miles away from Houston. But he dropped out before enrolling at his local college, the University of Houston, in his hometown, where he earned his degree in nuclear physics. When World War II broke out, Charles enlisted as a pilot in the U.S. Navy, and he served in the Office of Naval Intelligence. Now, when the war ended, he decided to go work at Shell Oil as a seismologist, and that's someone who studies earthquakes and generation of elastic waves through planets. And basically, it's to locate where oil is and sudden movements to predict if an oil rig is going to collapse or things like that. But suddenly, after working at Shell Oil for years, Charles abruptly quit his job in 1957 without giving any reason as to why. Associates of Charles would later tell investigators that he was a highly intelligent man who had a natural talent for locating gas and oil and gold for the companies he worked with, which was his main job, in order for them to drill at those locations he located. He was so smart that, according to them, he even spoke 7 languages, and he had a special interest in handheld radios. But the biggest qualm was Charles was kind of aloof. In the mid-1950s, Charles got a job at the Civil Air Patrol, where he allegedly met David Ferrie, a man who allegedly conspired in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. In 1965, Charles was still unemployed, living at home with his elderly parents in his childhood bedroom in Montrose neighborhood of Houston. The neighbors would describe him as recluse. He allegedly would not even speak with his parents face to face and would communicate by writing on pieces of paper and sliding them under the little gap in his bedroom door. Many neighbors actually didn't know that Charles was living with his parents full time because he would disappear from the house before the sun rose and then wouldn't come back home until after the sun had set. So he was keeping odd hours. It's kind of like he didn't wish to be seen, according to neighbors. Investigators went looking for Charles after finding his parents' dismembered bodies, but he disappeared in June of 1965. However, as the only main suspect in his parents' murders, he had to be located, but he disappeared before his parents' bodies were ever found. So he would never be located again because no one could ever find him, and he would never be able to be interrogated. So because of his aloofness and the mysterious ways around him, people began suspecting that Charles was actually involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. In a 1992 book that was published called The Man on the Grassy Knoll by John R. Craig and Philip A. Rogers, Charles's life was documented, and in this novel, this theory by the co-authors, Charles worked as a secret CIA agent who postulated to be believed to be impersonating Lee Harvey Oswald, the person who was convicted of killing John F. Kennedy, in Mexico City. So apparently when Charles fled Houston, he went to Mexico City is what they're claiming, and he was pretending to be Lee Harvey Oswald, along with other alleged people involved in the assassination, including Mark Smith, Charles Harrelson. They were all seen hanging out together. According to these co-authors, claimed that Charles Rogers, Charles Harrison, and another man named Chauncey Holt were actually the 3 tramps photographed the day of President Kennedy's assassination in the Dealey Plaza. So the 3 tramps were 3 men who were photographed after the assassination in the Dallas Park Square, where Kennedy died, by a local newspaper near the Texas School Bank Depository, leading police officers. And this picture, they were being led away from the crime scene by a police officer. So the theory in this book presented was that Charles had murdered his parents because his mom was tracing his calls after the president's death, and he fled to Guatemala to avoid being convicted of assassinating Kennedy, and to hush that his mom might know something, he had to kill her too. In a book review by Publishing Weekly, they said, and I quote in regards to the book, "The authors do a workmanlike job with their thesis, but the degree of poetic license in terms of reconstruction dialogue and attributed thought seems excessive here, and sourcing is virtually non-existent. Assassination buffs, however, will welcome a book for its novelty value and its easy readability." So they were saying it was all made up, basically. After 10 years of his disappearance and at all any sign of him being located again, in 1975, a local Houston judge declared Charles Rogers dead, legally dead, so his family estate could be prohibited, and proved in a court of law that the will of the deceased would be executed of all three. Because Charles was the only main suspect and the only true suspect in the death of his parents, the case went cold pretty soon after, and it remains unsolved. A few years later, a Houston couple consisting of Martha Gardner and her husband, forensic accountant Hugh Gardner, independently began to investigate the case and came to the conclusion themselves that allegedly, this is all their theory, Charles Rogers had murdered his parents, fled the country, and was later killed in Honduras. The pair dismissed the claim of John R. Craig and Philip A. Rogers that they wrote in their book that Charles was a secret CIA agent, because there was no evidence that this was true. But they did claim to have located that Charles had connections and dealings with the CIA agent. So he may have not been an agent himself, but he had dealings and connections to CIA agents because he got these connections through working as a cinematologist, which we know was his full-time job at Shell Oil. The Gardners had their own theory as to why Charles allegedly killed his parents, claiming he had plotted the murder for years due to his father being abusive during his childhood. They believed that his parents had uncovered that he had CIA connections by going through his diary, and in retaliation to keep them quiet, he had to end their lives. They also claimed in their book that Edwina and Fred were devious con artists, based on the theory that they found that Fred allegedly was a regular bookie engaging in illegal activities like gambling and fraud in Houston. Throughout their independent investigations, the Gardners believed that Fred's abuse of his son continued well into adulthood, especially after Charles moved back in with them, and Edwina began to steal money from her son. She would sign checks in her son's name, and when Charles found out, he snapped at his mother. Allegedly, this theory claims that Edwina would forge Charles's signature on deeds of land that he owned, and even that the Rogers home had been signed into Charles's name, unnoticed to him, not his parents, so the house was apparently legally his. The theory even extended that Edwina took out a second mortgage and a third mortgage on the home and would just pocket the money for herself to spend. They believe that after killing and dismembering his parents, Charles fled to Mexico and was never located because he had powerful friends in Mexico who were helping from people finding him. And he had met these friends through his hobby of playing with ham radios, and also a couple other people he had met when he was working for Shell Oil, and he even worked for some mining companies over the years. So people in powerful places. Finally, the Gardners believe that Charles left Mexico and traveled to Honduras, where he was eventually killed when he got into a wage dispute with local miners. Another theory that people had was that Charles had ran off to Canada after living off of a patch of land that he owned in Big Thicket, a place in East Texas, often visit alone for extended periods of times. 28 years later, after Charles being legally declared dead in October of 2003, a publisher called Redbud Publishing released a book titled The Icebox Murders, which was co-authored by the Gardners. In a review by the Houston Press, they said, and I quote, "The Icebox Murders is written as a fact-based fiction and supposition. There are many unnamed characters in the book, various politicians and attorneys, as well as the eyewitness who saw Rogers in his after 1965, which is basically the same sentiment that Publishers Weekly wrote in their review of the book, simply stating fact-based fiction. So truly, we don't know the real motive behind Fred and Edwina's death, or if truly the murders were at the hands of their own son. The house on 1815 Driscoll Street, where the murders took place, remained on the market, empty and unsold for many years on end. In 1972, the house was torn down and then the lot was leveled into an even field until the year 2000, when a condominium apartments were built on top of that lot, which still stands to this day. Besides the two books I mentioned earlier that presented these theories, Rogers remained a key character in two other books, both authored by James Ellroy. They were called The American Tabloid and The Cold 6000, a sequel to that first book. The Chronicle followed three friends, an FBI agent, a CIA agent, and a mafia personnel who were involved in Kennedy's assassination. But at the end of the day, most of these books were just conspiracies, and all of them were based off of the very true facts that Charles was a Navy man. He did earn his bachelor degree in a high field of science, and he did wake before rise and sundown, and it wouldn't return until the dark. But his neighbors were suspicious of his habits. You know, you make up theories, but that doesn't mean he was a CIA agent or involved in President Kennedy's assassination. So that is all the information I have on this case. As I said, it still remains a cold case because we don't know what happened. In reality, it allegedly seems that Charles murdered his parents and he took off, maybe not to get caught. Simple as not to get caught, maybe nothing more. But people kind of ran with the theory, things he could have lined up with. So let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case down below. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. We still have one more day, Holiday Hometown Horror Week, to get through. So I will see you tomorrow. Love you, mean it, kisses, don't do anything stupid, and I'll see you then. Bye.